You are the God who sees me. Du bist ein Gott, der mich sieht. Today a new year begins, and with the new year there are many expectations and hopes for a better life, for more money, more happiness, new opportunities, new people in our lives, new joys, but also new challenges, new problems, and difficulties, and hardships, some of which we've never had or seen before or maybe never even expected. What will we do? How will we cope and deal with these unforeseen circumstances? How will we even handle unexpected successes? We begin the new year looking behind at the old one and ahead to the new one in front of us, knowing first what or who has helped us in the past, and with that in mind, trusting with faith in the same person who has helped us then to bring us through what we cannot see ahead. But who is this person? And what is this thing that has helped us in the past and brought us to where we are today? Is it ourselves or our own abilities, determination, and strength? Or is it someone or something more beyond ourselves? If there is someone who is stronger than ourselves who can and will help us, who is this person? Do we know him? Should we know him? As Christians, we believe that it is God who surrounds us in our lives, in whom we live, move, and have our very being, as the Apostle Paul reminded the Greek philosophers on Mars Hill in Athens. We believe that God is immanent and in active control, not distant, not on autopilot. If God is in active control of our lives, He directs and guides us, helps us. And that means that He hears us and sees us in our difficulties, toils, distress, and oppression, and also in our success. How do we know and how do we experience this? Our sermon text today is one of many personal examples, historical accounts given about people in ancient times in the Bible, which are sometimes quite similar to our own experiences today when we take God seriously and ask for His help in many situations in our everyday lives. The story in our sermon text today takes place in the life of Abram, later Abraham, who lived in the Middle East nearly 4,000 years ago and who was specially called by God to leave his home city and home country and to move to a faraway place, the land of Canaan that God showed him, and then to receive a promise from God who would give him many descendants who would settle in this promised land, their inheritance of God's blessing. After making a stopover in Haran, a city in northern Mesopotamia and modern-day Iraq, Abram leaves his father's family after his father's death and moves southward to Canaan at age 75, already a mature man who would have already been expected to have a wife and family by this time. But despite God's promise to him of many descendants, at least one physical heir, 10 eventful years pass by and nothing happens. Because of severe famine in the promised land of Canaan, Abram has to move with his wife Sarai down to Egypt. And there where he, out of fear for his wife's safety, passes her off as his sister. She's actually his half-sister. And he allows her to be taken into the household of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, who treats her very well, and also Abraham's well, so well that he acquires lots of possessions and becomes richer. But someone sees this is wrong. And as a result, Pharaoh and his household are afflicted with serious diseases. Is this protection of Abram's wife Sarai a coincidence, or is it God? Pharaoh connects these illnesses with Abram and his wife. He gets behind the truth. He confronts Abram with his deceitfulness and expels him from his country. Leaving Egypt a lot richer, Abram returns to Canaan and again calls upon the name of the Lord. He separates from his nephew Lot, who also has much livestock. Lot moves southeast to greener pastures near Sodom. Abraham stays north and west with mostly wilderness. But despite this painful separation with his only remaining male family member, God reminds him of his promise to give him the whole land to Abram and to his descendants, like uncountable dust of the ground. He commands Abram to walk through it, keep walking and moving through it to become familiar with it. And perhaps that means in the process to keep trusting in God's firm promise to give him descendants to inherit this land. What can we learn today from this context of Abram's life? Keep moving and keep trusting in God's promise, even though we still don't see it. God promises Abram's descendants, but also after rescuing Abram's nephew and his nephew's possessions, who had been carried away as captives in a senseless war, God again blesses Abram through a strange unknown man, Melchizedek, the king of Salem, but he was also the priest of the Most High God, the same God Abram worshipped. Afterwards, God appears to Abram in a vision and gives him another confirmation that he plans to give Abram uncountable descendants, as much as the stars in the sky. Amazingly, Abram believes this promise, and God accepts him and his faith in him by establishing a formal covenant with him and his descendants which cannot be broken. But Abram still has no son, not even a daughter for that matter. More than 10 more years have passed by since God first made his promise to Abram, and nothing has happened. Is Abram's faith in God and his promise real or only an illusion? Is his promise real or only false hope? His wife Sarai is only getting older, and despite all hopes and attempts to get pregnant, she has long been known for being barren. How can an older man and an older barren woman have a child? Impossible. Not by any modern means at that time. What is the nature of God's promises? Are his promises only things that are humanly possible, normal, natural, physical processes, or do God's promises have an impossible element to them that, because after all, God is God and not man, and his promises therefore fit his beyond human nature? Do we know what God's promises are, even to us today, and do we understand them? Do we ever try to help God fulfill them, so to speak, because we think that he isn't working according to our schedule, or that he's forgotten, or is simply unable to get the job done? Or maybe God's promise means our active participation for his promise to be fulfilled. If so, how active must we be? Sarai, Abram's wife, knows her biological clock has stopped ticking, and she's long since run out of time to have a baby. Abram is now 85 and Sarah is 75 years old. But an ancient custom found in old Assyrian marriage contracts, the Code of Hammurabi, and also the Nuzi tablets, gives her a way, she thinks, to ensure the birth of a male heir and to solve the problem of her barrenness and help God fulfill his promise to them. She gives her Egyptian maidservant Hagar, whom she likely acquired years before when they lived there in Egypt, to her husband Abram as a concubine wife to sleep with and bear children for Sarai as Abram's physical descendants. As then the children of a woman bestowed by her mistress upon the husband were regarded as belonging to the wife, Sarai, despairing of a son herself, as she is now 75 and had been 10 years in Canaan, concluded that her heir was to be born of a substitute. Sarai is willing to go this far. Sarai gives her to give her husband into the embrace of another woman to get God's blessing and ensure descendants. But is God asking her to do this? Abram goes along with her idea. though not a good one because it's not God's idea. He sleeps with her and she gets pregnant. As God's Word, a truthful, historical, and spiritual witness, the Bible doesn't withhold from us intimate details about people's personal lives, their insecurities, and their daily interpersonal struggles. We see these mistakes, human failures, insecurities, and struggles clearly in our sermon text today. Sarai, Abram's princess, or contentious, quarrelsome one, as her name might mean, with special reference to her struggle against barrenness, understands that the Lord has kept her from having children. Does this mean that God is not going to keep His promise to give Abram many descendants? How can God keep His promise if nothing happens? Now. Will God fail if nothing happens? Now. Does God expect us to do something about it? Now. Indeed, the Bible teaches in several places that children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a special reward from Him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. And it is the Lord who settles the children of the childless woman in her home as a happy mother of children. Praise the Lord. Numerous other godly women of faith later on in the Bible also struggled with barrenness and asked the Lord for children. Some of them received sons even as signs of God's grace, blessing, and plan to save His people Israel. One of the two wives of Sarai's grandson, Jacob, Rachel, tried a similar method to have children with her husband through her handmaid Bilhah. Yet human attempts, whether by traditional customs or laws, to solve God's problems, invariably end either in utter failures or result in human conflicts and further struggles. All of this is because of our human imperfection and sinful nature. What's the problem that arises? Envy, pride, disrespect, sinful attitudes that come when people take matters into their own hands, so to speak, instead of waiting on God's timing. After Abram slept with Hagar and she conceived, and when she knew that she was pregnant, she began to despise, literally to weigh lightly in her eyes, her mistress. Marriage with one wife was and is still God's original plan and law. But when polygamy was introduced, it was only coupled with violence and license, besides envy and rivalry, reasons for terrible, unnecessary conflicts. As soon as Hagar becomes Abram's wife and gets pregnant by him, she turns proud and thinks that she is superior to her mistress and thrusts Sarah's authority over her aside. Do we trust in God's promises? Do we do important things God's way in our lives to honor Him? Or do we make compromises and rush to do very important things in life like marriage and having children man's way, or the way that we do it in this culture or in some other culture because we can't wait on God? Compounding Sarah's short-sightedness and Abram's weakness and lack of insight, Hagar's attitude is completely wrong and sinful. She weighs barren Sarai lightly in her eyes and thinks she's replaced Sarai to receive God's intended blessing instead. What happens when we realize that doing things our way instead of God's way, even if our intentions may seem good in the end, goes afoul? It causes more problems and conflicts than we'd ever expected. Do we blame God or blame other people around us or admit failure and ask God for forgiveness? Sarai's act seems like self-denial for Abram's sake. But now that being looked down upon by her maidservant, Sarai makes Abram responsible for this. She makes him answerable for it. He's responsible for this wrong, like an act of violence against her. May the bitter consequences of it return on him instead, for giving her maid into his embrace. A very unwise thing to do. even if no sin was intended. May God judge you, Abram, for it. Abram still regards Hagar as one of Sarai's servants, though as a secondary wife, and tells Sarai to do what is good in her own eyes, a recipe for trouble and mistreatment, more than just keeping the peace in one's household. Does Abram realize his own mistake in yielding to Sarai's impulsive wish and idea to fulfill God's promise on her own? Sarai humbles and oppresses her maidservant, reducing her to her original condition. It was Abram's job to make her yield to Sarai all due respect and submission. But in making her resume her old position as a slave, Sarai deals unkindly with her. In running away from her, Hagar not only tries to break free of slavery, but also lives up to her name, Hagar, which means wandering in Hebrew. It seems natural just to bolt and run away from any kind of oppression or even proper correction, somebody putting us rightfully in our place, like a wild, untamable horse, like her promised son Ishmael will often be later in his life. Have we ever done this ourselves? How many people today on this first day of the year, New Year 2023, are at the moment running away when faced with some sort of perceived or real situation of unfairness, ill treatment, or oppression? How many people today, like Hagar, are covering up something in their lives that's hurt them deeply, but instead of facing it, they run away from it, instead of looking at themselves in the process and dealing with it? In fleeing, they and we ourselves might be crying out in desperation, does anybody care anyway? Does anybody see the terrible situation I'm in right now? The angel of the Lord, who speaks for God here in the first person and is spoken about as God, both distinguished from the Lord and identified with Him, finds Hagar near the spring of water in the desert, probably very tired and thirsty. Hagar. Many early church fathers believed that this angel was, in fact, the pre-incarnate manifestation of Christ as God's messenger servant in the Old Testament. He calls her by name, recognizing her identity as Sarai's servant, not as Abraham's wife, and asks her where she's coming from and where she's going. Does she really have a plan in mind? Is it really any better or safer from where she's fleeing from? We remember God's words to Adam and Eve, hiding in the bushes in the Garden of Eden. Adam, where are you? God sees and cares about all people who are running from someone or something in their lives that they should face and stand and face and deal with, even with themselves and their own sins and failures. We should know God is also calling us today on this first day of the new year 2023 with two questions. Where have you come from? And where are you going? Do we know the answers to these questions? What do the answers to these questions have to do with God? God is looking for straight, honest answers, which Hagar gives here. She knows she's fleeing from her mistress, Sarai, but does she know where she's really going to? When we or someone else who is fleeing all different kinds of things, when we do this, when we or someone else, we don't want to face up to life, things that we don't want to face in life. We're fleeing from these things. When we honestly admit that we're fleeing, and we understand that God is asking and listening, we can and we should be open to what He tells us to do next, where we are going or where we should be going. The angel of the Lord tells her something that's tough, it's direct, and perhaps very hard to accept. But it is right and it is the truth and should be done for her own good, perhaps also for her safety, and something more. Go back to your mistress and submit to her. Literally, bow humbly under her hand, the angel says. Can she do that? Could we do that if we were in her shoes? The angel, not someone you see every day, by the way, adds a promise of blessing for Hagar and maybe for us too. There in verse 10 he says, I will certainly increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. Sounds like the promise made to Abram just a few chapters before, doesn't it? Like dust of the earth. It also sounds like something pretty far away. What does this blessing mean right now for the coming days, weeks, months, and years? How will Hagar's life be different now because of God's promise to her? What is she supposed to do? The angel tells her, have your baby. Don't abort it or try to kill it in running away from problems you have trouble dealing with right now. Name your son Ishmael, which means God has heard of your misery. God has an even further plan for her son's life that He reveals to Hagar. That God sees, hears of the misery of His people and people in distress world over who cry out to Him is a message we read about often in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. Do we know people today who are sincerely crying out to God because of some affliction or oppression? Will we cry out to God with them and lead them to God's help and hope? In the end, how does Hagar respond to God's questions, commands, and promises? She calls on God's holy name and knows who God really is and what He is like. He is not some faraway deity who just set the universe in motion like a clockmaker long since gone from his clock. He is not some mystical, impersonal force or an angry, impatient cosmic power who strikes you dead for every personal failure. Though Hagar only sees the back of God, she knows and experiences that He is the God who sees her in the here and now, in her distress, affliction, uncertainty about the future, despite her wrong choices, attitudes, and behavior. She might try to escape the attention and the oppression of her mistress and her wrong choices, but she cannot escape the attention of the God who sees her and all. The psalmist King David also knows about this God, knows about God when he writes in Psalm 139 verse 7, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?" Hagar names the nearby well that certainly quenches her thirst, the well of the living one who sees me. That is, God sees Hagar. But another possible translation is the other way around. The well of the one who sees me, God, and lives. Hagar also sees God and lives, just as others also do later on in the Old Testament. Many examples. This place, this well, is still well known later in Abram's life and centuries later up to the time of Moses. What major changes happen in Hagar's life as a result of her encounter with the living God who sees her? She returns to her mistress Sarai and bears Abram a son, which he names Ishmael, just as God had said and instructed her to do. Her life doesn't get any easier, as she now has a child to care for, as well as her duties as a maidservant to Sarai. But she knows that God is real, remains true to His promises, and will ultimately give her and her son blessings undeserved. She can live on, fulfill her duties as a maidservant, serve her mistress in this hope of greater blessing. This is also what we are called to do and be as Christians in this new year 2023. We can trust God because He already sees us and will turn to help and guide us in the new year with everything, even when we ourselves don't know how things will go on. God certainly sees unjust, difficult situations we find ourselves in. He sees also our sometimes poor and wrong reactions to these situations and our attempts to run away from our sin problems and wrong relationships that we need to deal with. God sees our life-threatening needs, even persecution for our faith in Jesus. Yet He still has a plan for our lives, even when it means accepting some hardships. Jesus tells His disciples and us in John chapter 16, verse 33, "In this world you will have trouble in every direction, in every way. But take heart, I have overcome the world." Jesus tells us these things. He says in John 16, verse 33, that in Him we may have peace. In keeping with the watchword for the new year 2023, my prayer today for us is this: may the living One who sees me and sees you, even in our troubles, guide and comfort us all every day in this new year 2023 and give us faith in Him with His peace. Amen.